All men are created equal. This is a quote that our country has in its Declaration of Independence. Yet it seems like our country hasn't lived up to this quote. For hundreds of years, African Americans in our country have been treated unfairly. For years, African Americans have fought to make sure they're treated equally. One of the biggest examples of this was the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was a struggle for social justice that took place mainly during the 1950s and 60s for Black Americans to gain equal rights under the law in the United States. The Civil War had officially abolished slavery, but it didn't end discrimination against Black people. They continued to endure devastating effects of racism, especially in the South. By the mid-20th century, they mobilized and began an unprecedented fight for equality that spanned 2 decades. In 1868, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution gave Black people equal protection under the law. In 1870, the 15th Amendment granted Black American men the right to vote. Still, many white Americans, especially those in the South, were unhappy that people they'd once enslaved were now on a more or less equal playing field. To marginalize Black people, keep them separate from white people, and erase the progress they made during Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws were established in the South beginning in the late 19th century. Black people couldn't use the same public facilities as white people, live in many of the same towns or go to the same schools. Interracial marriage was illegal, and most Black people couldn't vote because they were unable to pass voter literacy tests. Segregation gained even more ground in 1896 when the Supreme Court declared in Plessy v. Ferguson that facilities for Black and white people could be separate but equal. Years later, President Harry Truman initiated a civil rights agenda and in 1948 issued Executive Order 9981 to end discrimination in the military. These events helped set the stage for grassroots initiatives to enact racial equality legislation and incite civil rights movement. This movement would cause many people to begin to protest and fight for what they believe was right. On December 1st, 1955, a 42-year-old woman named Rosa Parks found a seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus after work. Segregation laws at the time stated that Black passengers must sit in designated seats at the back of the bus, and Parks had complied. When a white man got on the bus and couldn't find a seat in the white section at the front of the bus driver instructed Parks and 3 other Black passengers to give up their seats. Parks refused and was later arrested. As word of her arrest ignited outrage and support, Parks became the mother of the modern-day civil rights movement. Black community leaders formed the Montgomery Improvement Association led by Martin Luther King Jr., a role which would place him front and center in the fight for civil rights. Parks' courage incited the MIA to stage a boycott of the Montgomery bus system. This would last 381 days. On November 14, 1956, the Supreme Court ruled segregated seating as unconstitutional. In 1954, the civil rights movement gained momentum when the United States Supreme Court made segregation illegal in public schools in the case of the Brown v. Board of Education. In 1957, Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas asked for volunteers from all Black high schools to attend the formerly segregated school. On September 3, 1957, 9 Black students known as the Little Rock Nine arrived at Central High School to begin classes but were instead met by the Arkansas National Guard and a screaming, threatening mob. The Little Rock Nine tried again a couple weeks later and made it inside but had to be removed for their safety when violence ensued. Finally, President Dwight D. Eisenhower intervened and ordered federal troops to escort the Little Rock Nine to and from classes at Central High. Still, the students faced continual harassment. Their efforts, however, brought much-needed attention to the issue of desegregation and fueled protests on both sides of the issue. On May 4, 1961, 13 freedom riders, 7 Black and 6 white activists, mounted a Greyhound bus in Washington, D.C., embarking on a bus tour of the American South to protest segregated bus terminals. They were testing the 1960 decision by the Supreme Court that declared the segregation of interstate transportation facilities unconstitutional. Facing violence from both police officers and white protesters, the freedom riders drew international attention. On Mother's Day 1961, the bus reached Anniston, Alabama, where a mob mounted the bus and threw a bomb into it. The freedom riders escaped the burning bus but were badly beaten. However, this wouldn't stop them. On May 24, 1961, a group of freedom riders reached Jackson, Mississippi. Though met with hundreds of supporters, the group was arrested for trespassing in a whites-only facility and sentenced to 30 days in jail. Attorneys for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People brought the matter to the U.S. Supreme Court, who reversed the convictions. Hundreds of new freedom riders were drawn to the cause, and the riots continued. In the fall of 1961, under pressure from the Kennedy administration, the Interstate Commerce Commission issued regulations prohibiting segregation in interstate transmit terminals. Arguably one of the most famous events of the civil rights movement took place on August 28, 1963, the March on Washington. It was organized and attended by civil rights leaders such as A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and Martin Luther King Jr. More than 200,000 people of all races congregated in Washington, D.C. for the peaceful march with the main purpose of forcing civil rights legislation and establishing job equality for everyone. The highlight of the march was King's I Have a Dream speech, which quickly became a slogan for equality and freedom. President Lyndon B. Johnson would later sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law on July 2nd of that year. The law guaranteed equal employment for all, limited the use of voter literacy tests, and allowed federal authorities to ensure public facilities were integrated. When President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law on August 6, 1965, he took the Civil Rights Act of 1964 several steps further. The new law banned all voter literacy tests and provided federal examiners in certain voting jurisdictions. Now, this is just a small portion of the events and people who participated in the civil rights movement, and even though African Americans made a lot of progress in the way they were treated in America at the time, we still to this day are seeing the discrimination and hatred towards African Americans in our country today, with the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor being two recent cases. In order for us to fix this problem and make a change, we as a new generation need to continue to step up and fight for what we believe in. We need the people who have the leadership skills like Martin Luther King Jr., the people who have the braveness like the Freedom Riders and Rosa Parks, and the people who have the determination like the Little Rock 9 group. If we as a generation can step up, I definitely believe we can make a change.